Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a run of, two things actually, some articles online that are doing the rounds about how conditions in East Africa and other parts of Africa are diabolical for the local people. There's famine, there's people are starving, or so it's alleged are starving, and these people should have a right to any poor black person in Africa should have a right to move to the rich West, because two reasons are cited. One is they're poor, and the other is that climate change is the principal cause of them being poor, and any other causes are the fault of white people, colonialism, and da da da. So, okay. Now, at the same time, there's adverts running around, from the international NGOs and the activist groups who conveniently are dovetailing in with and working in clearly in an overall sort of choreographed narrative that there's poor little Mbongo in Africa, and he's got some sort of illness, and he can't see, or he's this or that, whatever it is, some sort of medical ailment, and little Magumbo and little Mabamba, and they have a right with their family and wider family and the whole fucking village really to come to the West, where they can get medical care and medical attention. And don't you care about little Mabamba in her pink outfit? Because if you don't care about it, then you are fucking Hitler. I mean, seriously. So let's just try and sort of untangle this ridiculous propaganda mess that's being pushed upon us. Again, it's part of the wider justification of moving masses of black people into the West. But now, no one can say that the situation in like parts, Sudan and East Africa generally, and Somalia aren't pretty grim. They are. But the way the propaganda illustrates is it's a recent event. This was a fucking paradise until recently. And the reason it's not a paradise today is because of climate change primarily, which is causing crop failures and droughts and whatever else. So climate change, that's caused by white people, the climate change, and colonialism. And so the reason that Africa is in a bad way, or black people are in a bad way, is purely down to 100% white people are to blame, and therefore, as reparations, all these black people have to come to the West. Now, what do they ignore? This, how do they ignore the reality and the facts? When you look at if you look at the early Roman accounts of sub-Saharan Africa, which they didn't penetrate into too far, the Romans were mainly in the Mediterranean coast, but to whatever extent the Romans did go beyond that, then they were astonished at how technically backward the people were. They just couldn't believe. They're also amazed at how ready they were to sell out their fellow brothers and citizens as slaves. The Romans were quite. Now the Romans had a preference for white slaves. They believed the black slaves were unreliable and this, and so they preferred white slaves. And the white slaves typically, not all, but typically were, especially if they were, say, Greeks that were, indentured servants, probably more than slaves. But the difference between the two being quite small. The Greeks were taken in as, say, tutors and school teachers and so on. So and then the what today we'd call the Slavic race, which is from the origin of slaves, were brought in to perform various household duties. For example, they wanted runners to run messages from household to household, to run around Rome or wherever delivering messages. So there were certain people that were deemed as being good and reliable and capable of doing that work and so on. Anyway, the Romans were staggered at how backward these people were. Now, we can go back even further than that. If we look at the time of the early Carthaginian sort of settlements, if you like, around what today is the coast around Tunisia, they developed quite rudimentary, but they learned how to smelt iron ore, to work with iron and produce iron implements and weapons and building materials such as nails, things like that. So that was around 900 BC. Now, even the early Carthaginians and Phoenicians were astonished at how backward the black Africans, sub-Saharan, again, not that they had that much to do with them, but in terms of some of the Phoenician trading vessels would crawl down the African coast, the west coast, and they do some trading with the locals. And they again were surprised at how even then these people were 1,000 years behind where the Phoenicians were, and even more than that they were still in the Stone Age, whereas the Europeans had gone through the Bronze Age and all that sort of stuff. So they were easily 2,000 more than 2,000 years behind, and this is in 900 BC. So this idea that the reason Africa is poor is because of what white people do to climate change is beyond insane. I mean, it's beyond insane when you realise that these were not even an advanced Stone Age people, but really an early to mid Stone Age people. Now, then you come, so you go from 900 BC to look at the early Europeans, or even the early Arabic traders that were around the east coast of Africa, and you look at their writings and their observations at the time, and they said almost exactly the same thing as the Phoenicians had had. So now we're talking 1,500 years have passed, 1,500 years have passed, but yet the observations of the Arab traders, say around 800 AD, say, is almost the same word for word as the early Phoenician traders in 900 BC. So this is the in other words, the black populations in Africa technologically have been frozen in time for 1,500 years. And you'd say, well, that's not possible because they've been exposed to, the Phoenicians, they've been exposed to Arab traders, they've been exposed to the Romans, they've been exposed to various influences of civilizations that are technologically vastly ahead of where they were. But yet somehow none of it seems to have seeped through. None of it seems to have permeated through the cracks. And the only thing that the black people appear to this is the sub-Saharan Africans I'm talking about, back in the day, the only thing they seem to have thought about was, hey, we can supply you guys with slaves, if you want them. And so slaves were going to, around the Arabic trading ports and Arabic trading stations around there. They were pretty much all had their genitals removed, so they couldn't procreate. But and many of them died, of course, as a result of the clumsy operations. But the 1,500 years has gone by, and there's no technological advancement, either society, organisationally, or technically. Now let's come to when the Europeans first started turning up, around 1,500 or so. And this is in the early days. This was like the Spanish and the Portuguese and so on. And and you read their observations. Now we've jumped forward another 700 or so years now. So we're now, 2,200, 2,300 years on from when the Phoenicians first encountered the sub-Saharan Africans. And again, the Phoenicians didn't go that far south, so the interaction wasn't sort of on a mass scale or anything like that. So we're now, when the Europeans first turned up in Africa, what were their observations of Africa, sub-Saharan African? This is sub-Saharan African life. Their observations were the same as the Phoenicians. So we've now gone forward 2,400, 2,500 years, and nothing has changed. The observations in 900 BC are exactly the same by the Phoenicians then, are exactly the same by the Spanish and the Portuguese 2,500 years later. So they're now been frozen in time for 2,500 years. Now, given the trading ports that the Europeans began to set up, this is what became the slaving ports in West Africa, going from West Africa to, the Americas generally, the Caribbean and so on. The Africans are now exposed to the most modern technology in iron forging, metals forging, shipbuilding, sails, rigging, technologically thousands of years ahead of where they are. Somehow this doesn't seem to seep through either. Why? How? It's right there in front of them. Why doesn't some enterprising go? But no, it doesn't seem to happen. Now, fast forward another 300 years, give or take, and this is where the British are now penetrating into the interior, or the French too, into the interior of Africa, David Livingstone, those sort of people, into the interior of Africa. And what are their observations? And it's exactly the same. Their description of the Africans, black Africans at the time, is exactly the same as the Phoenicians described in 900 BC. So we're now 2,800 years, and for that whole period of time, the black African, wider diaspora, and there's many different tribes here, by the way, the black African diaspora is frozen in time. Again, they're identified as an early Stone Age people. So when we come now to this idea that Africa was this rich, prosperous place, and it was all plundered by evil whitey, that just doesn't hold up to even a tiny little bit of scrutiny. Now, coming to the next stage, where in a very advanced technological civilization, certainly on a relative basis, comes along and says, gee whiz, look at all this iron ore here, look at all this land that you're not growing crops on, look at all this raw materials. Wow, you've got a nice deep water port here, or we can turn this into a deep water port. And so the Europeans would come with their technology and their ability to see opportunity and develop opportunities, for example, mining or agriculture or whatever. And this was something that the black Africans hadn't seen or understood, nor could they comprehend it. So we can get that rock, and out of that rock, we can get this metal ore, ORE, we can get this metal ore, and then we can turn that into, buildings, and we can turn it into these things. We can turn it into weapons and tools like axes and spades and shovels, those sorts of things, and hammers. We can turn. Now this was. Remember, we're talking an early Stone Age people here, so this is thousands of years beyond their capacity to comprehend. And they will take that off there, and we'll give you guys some jobs, or we'll give you guys, in return for this, we'll give you some of the things that we make, like we'll give you axes and hammers and shovels and whatever. Now, these are people that are still using stone or wooden tools. So they look at these iron things, go, whoa, you'll give me some of those if I sort of let you know. So the trading and business arrangements that were made, you look at it and say, well, you should have educated those black people to understand exactly what iron ore was and how it's made and how it's smelted and all the technology that goes into it. And then you should have paid a premium price for the iron. Well, no, the Europeans had to build the roads, they had to build the railways, they had to build the mines from scratch. They do a lot of things. Some serious investment here. So the idea that they should have, from minute one, paid a premium price, then that doesn't hold up, and the Africans would have squandered it anyway. If you look at, say, all the not all, but certainly many of the hugely successful, say, in the United States, and they've been there for hundreds of years, successful black athletes that have made millions from, say, being, sporting achievements, and yet the money is, they see it all as a sort of a tribal amount of money, so they squander money. They let it just go through their fingers like sand, like water, and so they've wasted. So these people that are worth gazillions, they've made gazillions, and yet they're penniless in years to come. I was staggered at how often Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, given the millions that he made, how often he was close to broke. In spite of the millions, it had all been frittered away through parasitic relatives and friends and so on. So this was the case, that when you gave valuable things to the Africans, they'd squander it all, and they'd live in the fever of the moment. And the vapors of the mind would sort of explode, and then they'd be back to having not a penny to their name, and would be wandering around wanting more handouts. And this was always the pattern, whether it's in America today, all throughout Africa, and so on, through the modern era up to the present day. So these areas now, a number of things, the observations that were made again, even by the Romans, was as soon as these people had any, if there were a few years of good seasons of harvests, the weather was absolutely pristine, and there was no civil war or anything at the time, and so the harvests and the food was bountiful, and there was lots of game to hunt, this sort of thing. Then they would immediately procreate on a grand scale. So as soon as there was the rains didn't come in the quantity, and as soon as the food supply sort of was reduced, they would have widespread starvation and death and disease and apocalyptic things. This was always the cycle that the Romans observed, that the Arabs observed, that the early Europeans observed, that the British observed. So this has always been a cycle forever. And you see the same thing in places like, wherever you have agricultural peasant societies, you see the same thing. When the food is bountiful in supply, so same as any creatures really that live that basic sort of on the land hunter-gatherer type existence. They tend to have this procreate the instant that times are good. Now, the idea that they have is that when you're old and infirm, which happens at like 40 or something in those places, then if you have children to look after you because you've had many children, then this is a good thing. But of course, it's the survival rate of the children is pretty low, and we see this happening in Somalia and Sudan and places like this today. Ethiopia, the list goes on. As soon as these people have more food and more resources, they will immediately procreate to an extent. So when you look at the Live Aid thing for Africa, that was Bob Geldof, that rock star, played a big role in this, and they gave lots of food to Ethiopia. In the middle of a famine. Now, in the middle of a famine, and so they're just relying on food being brought in to help them not starve. But as soon as that food arrives, they procreate. The instant the food arrives, they procreate, and so the population doubled in 10 years or so. And so now that then created a bigger overhang in terms of whether was there local resources to support this. So this idea of people dying, the famine, the food supply, droughts, and so on, this has been going on forever. So why is the propaganda machine trying to say that it's something new and unique and recent and so on? The causes of the famine are the same as they've always been. When times are good, people procreated way too much, and even then couldn't sustain the children they were having. They knew that medical care was difficult to access. It's a very poor country, very, very corrupt, in a constant state of tribal civil war and so on. But these are very simple people who don't think about tomorrow or the day after that. They're responding to the minute and to the, today I've got enough to eat, so I'll procreate and so on. So they're responding very much. So why should these people be moved to the West as some sort of compensation or some sort of redress? Well, they shouldn't. There's no reason for it. This is the natural state of Africa for all time, going back to 900 BC and the first Phoenician observations, to the Romans, to the early Arabs, to the early Europeans, to the British. The whole thing, it's always been the same. So that the British were staggered that most of the African tribes, there are a couple of exceptions to Zulus, for example, but most of the African tribes and areas that they noticed were still in an early Stone Age level of development, as was the case in Australia, for example. So to try and suggest or imply that these people were technologically the equal of all the other places in the world at the time, and therefore have been hard done by or ripped off, or they're somehow entitled to some sort of reparations or redress, is absolute nonsense. And yet it's a propaganda thing that's doing the rounds. Now, we all feel bad when little Magombo is going hungry in Africa. Everybody feels bad. I mean, nobody doesn't feel bad about that. But how do you solve the problem as in on an ongoing basis? I don't know how that can be done. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.